Welcome back to True Image, the podcast where I'm going to share with you weekly the experiences, ideas, and themes that are expanding my self awareness, self love, and creativity so that you can feel into more of your truth through mine. As always, thank you for your curiosity and your time. This week's episode. Hello, and welcome to episode 3, which, just for your information, I have recorded before and I lost the recording. So here I am once again. Me or you, we will never know what I originally said and how I said it. So here is a new version. and I'm actually really excited because I actually experienced new things since the first time that I recorded this, which could pertain or contribute very interestingly to the topic that I want to go over today, which is, well, let me start with the story. So, last April, as in 2024 April, I officially moved to Bosnia and Herzegovina. And I didn't know that I would be moving here. I had actually intended to stay in London. And, you know, I'm the child of a diplomat, so, or at least ex-diplomat now. But so that means I grew up sort of all over the place and moving to many different countries. And you'd think that I was good at relocating, but I'm actually really, really not. I always hermit like the first 3 months, if not more. Especially, well, here it's been a challenge because of the language, which I'll get into in a second. But this isn't really a story about moving. The reason why I bring it up as the starting point is that moving does something to the psyche. And if you've moved, had one really big move or had multiple big moves, then you'll know what I'm talking about here. But it pertains to the topic of today, which is truth, or whether there is truth at all. Okay, so why I start with moving is because every time I have moved, I basically have an existential crisis. And it revolves around two things in particular that make me buffer for longer than I'd like to admit every single time. So the first thing is usually I have had some kind of major culture shock. And the second thing is having kind of a major identity shock, which they sort of come hand in hand in my experience. I really believe that discovering another culture is a little bit like that and is a little bit of almost an assault on those two things. Your sense of culture, your sense of identity, and therefore, I would argue, your sense of truth. So you might think, okay, well, I've traveled places, I understand different cultures, and yes, it might give you a taste of what I'm talking about, but you know, even if you stay in one place for a few months, it does not guarantee that you learn or rather absorb anything from that culture at all. Because the return home all too easily means that you're returning to the habits and the thought patterns and sort of like a settling back in. And it reminds you of your very specific way that you believe the world works. It's kind of like, I like to think about it like an animal's habitat. We have our own habitats, and ready for the pun, it's where your habits are at. Okay. So, when you move somewhere, it changes. Because if you were just to travel somewhere and sort of want to absorb the culture when you go back home, it takes a lot of intention, repeated immersion of some kind, I don't know, television, music, whatever, and an emotional experience tied to that place or that culture to keep something alive in you. So vacations, you know, just a brief vacation for me is kind of an illusion of cultural immersion. Whereas If you stay somewhere for longer and you decide to stay, right, your habits are forced to change. You find a new supermarket, you find a new coffee place, a new place to work out, you remake your home, and maybe discover all the possible routes home. It's not just you anymore, it's you in this new place. Possibly even, as I said, learning a new language. But even if you already speak the language, I would say that it's not 100% guaranteed that you settle in quickly either. Your identity, however true it might feel for you, becomes instantly blurry. So the other shock that I was talking about was when you realize that another society living on this same planet with the same global economy and global issues and humanness sees the same things as completely different than how you see them. Even in the lucky circumstance of moving somewhere where you already know the language, as I said, it doesn't guarantee much in terms of this thing that I'm talking about. So what does that mean for the concept of truth? Well, to me, these things have made me question if there even is such a concept as truth at all. Because for something to be true, according to the dictionary, by the way, it has to be in accordance with fact or reality. And I put that in quotes. Because reality, at least as far as I've seen, is subject to some pesky shapeshifting. Take language, for instance. I've been learning the local language here for a little over 4 months, kind of on and off, to be honest, but it's the hardest language that I've probably ever had to learn for multiple reasons, but among the most frustrating of them is that I have never encountered so many phrases and sayings that are simply not translatable. And this happens really often, but when someone says something and I ask for a translation and I'm met with the words, "You can't translate that," I want to flip the table. And it's no one's fault, of course, but I can't help but feel a little bit dejected every time because I'm essentially suddenly not privy to the quote unquote reality of that specific moment. Reality lives in others in a way that it does not live in me in that moment. Moreover, they have words to describe it and I don't. So the same goes for our perceptions of pretty much everything else, from government systems to, money, to even what tangible items are and look like. For instance, we may all agree generally on what constitutes a table, but if you were to ask every person to think of a table, the likelihood is that most people would think of something different than the person next to them, like the shape, the texture, the color. So whose reality is truth? There is no accordance there, so truth by definition cannot exist. There's a person I have to invite to the table for this conversation. And while he may be long ago dead, he is not long ago forgotten. So I first read his book or essay, or I don't even really know what to call it. Anyway, Plato. His works, let's keep it general, Republic and Symposium, in my first year at university. And I didn't expect to, but I loved them. And not in a very, academic way, but in the sense that, when something leaves an impression on you because it changes the way that maybe you think about yourself or life in general. And it still influences me very much today. It pops up more often than I even realize. But that being said, when you can no longer converse with an author, everything comes down to interpretation. So here's mine. So you may or may not have heard of Plato's allegory of the cave. If you have, then you're a step ahead. But regardless, just follow along with the little visualization here, expressed in my words, as close to the truth as truth. There we go. As close to what he wrote as I can possibly get it. And you can close your eyes if you want to, if it helps you picture it. But if not, no worries. Don't do that. If you're doing something that requires attention, trust yourself. Okay. So first and foremost, picture a cave or a cavern, let's say. Now, facing towards the large back wall, picture people in shackles with chains that are tied to the ground. Now, these people are not fighting their restraints, at least not anymore. Or maybe they never did. The reason why is because they're distracted by the shadows on the wall, which are figures cast or sort of created by the light of a fire, which is in the center of the cavern. And it's outlining the movement of other people in shackles, or simply just others who are roaming about the cavern. So basically the fire is behind the people in shackles looking at the wall, right? These prisoners have opinions and thoughts about what they see projected on the wall. They react to them, they see them, and most importantly, they believe them and they see them as truth. Because from their perspective, this is what exists. This is all that exists. Plato addresses what it's like for one of these people to, for example, remove their shackles and become free. So it's disorienting at first to see the actual shape of what's, creating these shadows. And it's so disorienting, in fact, that most people still cling to the shadow reality for longer than you'd think or expect. Maybe they roam the cave, which, by the way, also contributes to the shadows for the others, or they stay, which is perhaps even more scary. They stay even if they're unshackled, and they stay staring at the wall because they still believe it's truth. Plato also describes that whether by nagging curiosity or non-fulfillment or sometimes necessity, the free person or the newly freed person will eventually make their way further away from the shadow wall and head towards the opening of the cave, where there is waiting the outside world of more, if you want to call it, abundant and quote-unquote true forms of things. The moon, stars, the sun, trees, etc. He will feel the calling, let's say, and desire to seek truth, to stay in truth as far away from the shadows and the shackles as possible, realizing the depth of the illusion or deception, if you want to say, that he just escaped. So this is the metaphor, and there is no, at least I hope, literal cave in anybody's life, or fire, or prisoners, although you never know the corners of this world. In this metaphor, they are representations of essentially limited realities, the shadows, right, versus truth, which is the true forms outside of the cave in our world. And that's how a large portion of humans exist in the world, as bundles of limited realities, filtering truth through different lenses, casting shadows on the wall in front of them and mistaking them for reality. So that was really hard for me to read the first time that I read it, because I got all these questions. I mean, it's like, how can truth exist in a world like that, where we're all just living in our own illusions of things, or what we think is truth but isn't actually truth? Especially when the question moves from what is money or what is a table to what constitutes peace or what constitutes human, like being who is human and who's not. What's the truth of that? Debates like that naturally take us into dangerous territory, though not unfamiliar. So what is the purpose of life if it's so bleak? If there is no truth or meaning to be found, what is the point of self-awareness, of learning, of pursuing truth, of pursuing peace, or experiencing anything if reality is blurred and illusory. So I did not have an answer, but over time, I have realized that therein lies the answer. What I realized, and this is not a truth that, or a truth, see, there I go again. This is not an idea that I had, gotten immediately. This took a while after I read what I read. So I think it was a year and a half ago that this really started to grow in me and actually settle and became a part of my philosophy of life, which is that I don't think truth can be translated into words. It has to be experienced and felt, if you want to put it that way, moment to moment. Because if there is such a thing as truth out there in the world, I don't believe humans, imperfect as we are, can know it in its entirety, much less put it into words. Our views are too clouded with identity and culture, which are just, by the way, narrative layers over lots and lots and lots of generations. And it's why I think that being intentional with those two particular things, identity and culture, is super important and a process that everyone should go through. Questioning and affirming and choosing and, that kind of thing. Because, and even then, the fact remains that we're actually best off getting really comfortable with the idea that we're never really fully going to know. And it's our job to determine what works for us. Because we're not human knowings, we're human beings, right? So our existence is not about knowing truth, it's about experiencing life, being in life, and experiencing each other and this earth. And it's those experiences had in every single present moment, which are the only truth. Because even memory is subject to influence and change, whether by disease or just the unreliability of it. Like my roommate at university, actually, she came back from a class one day. She was taking a psychology course, and she said to me, this blew my mind. She was like, did you know that when we remember an event, we're not remembering the actual event. Our brains are recounting the last time we remembered it, meaning that each time we remember something, the event becomes less accurate. Back to this allegory, right? We are left with something I find, in the end, actually quite inspiring, despite it being very uncertain. Now, in doing research for this episode, I actually forgot about this final detail of the allegory, which is why I was like, okay, great. We end on a really hopeful note. Even though I had come to some of these conclusions myself, I had forgotten that Plato even wrote about this. So it's something to the effect of this. So back to the freed prisoner, right? He may want to stay outside of the cave, having newly discovered the world of quote-unquote true forms, which exists beyond the darkness. However, it is actually their responsibility as the more enlightened, though not better than, by the way, that's very important, as the more enlightened individual to re-enter the cave and convey to those still shackled what exists beyond their current experience. So I don't think Plato necessarily put it in this way, but I believe the best way to free others is actually through stories. The stories of you. Because this is kind of a consensus reality, right? The things that we have experienced within our own little corner of life and existence, in combination with the stories and experiences of others, begin to piece together the multiplicities of truth and experience that make up human existence. And we expand each other, right? The present moment is truth, as it is the only reality which exists. When you experience new forms of truth in the present moment, and new forms of the human experience, it is a story worth sharing, because it expands the collective consensus reality, it expands empathy, it expands self-awareness for each subsequent present moment and for each subsequent person that it's told to. So, I'm committing to these two things above all else because that's what I've learned to be the purpose. Existence is the first gift. Sharing it is the second. Everything seems to flow from those two things. And while it's a little broad and maybe a little daunting and uncertain, I don't think we need purpose beyond that. Whew, I got really fired up for this one, actually. Maybe this is why I had to re-record it. It was meant to be. Episode 3, and we're already hitting on some meaning of life questions. I really don't think they'll all be this heavy hitting, but I can't promise that always. This is what I love to talk about. So, I don't know. Bump up against the world, share with the world, be as much yourself as possible, question. Find your answer in your body, what resonates, and I think everything follows from there. Your purpose, your path, your impact.